For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu.
Ultimately, if theology is about its two words, theos, logos, it's words about God, being able to speak truly and rightly about God, who is the source of our being and the one to whom we return. It means an inquiry into the biggest questions of them all. And theology, properly speaking, allows you to ask those questions in a way that very few other disciplines do. So on the one hand, I think in order to understand the modern world, you've got to understand theology. But on the other hand, it seems to me theology opens up a whole series of the biggest questions, and it gives you all kinds of ways of approaching those. So it just seems to me endlessly fascinating. I don't know why anyone else would want to do anything else.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Words make worlds, says one of my podcasting heroes, Krista Tippett. Ask any poet, priest, or politician, and they'll also agree. Language does have that power, for better or for worse. But whatever power words have to make a world that we can then ourselves inhabit, to live inside of, that power is drawn from the archetypal word, the word made flesh, by whom all things are made, and in whom all things are held together, and for whom all tongues will confess. So this simple definition offered by Bishop Graham Tomlin, that theology is just, quote, words about God, is actually quite expansive. When our words about God are directed first toward God, but then toward the church and the world, theology lives up to its purpose of worship, reform, and witness. Graham Tomlin is president of St. Mellitus College and author of many books of theology and Christian spirituality. He recently completed his tenure as Bishop of Kensington and now leads the Church of England's Center for Cultural Witness. He joins Matt Croasmun today for a conversation about the meaning and potential of theology. Thanks for listening.
Graham, if I may, I'm so glad that you're able to be here.
Delighted to be here. Really looking forward to it. Yeah.
So let's start on the positive side. As you take a look at theology as it's practiced or taught in various different contexts, what do we have to be encouraged by? What's going right in theology these days?
Well, from my perspective, and certainly I look at things from the UK, and that may be different from here in the US, but I do see a greater movement towards theology connecting with the church. I think theology has been done much more in church contexts now, which I think is a good thing. One of the things that is worth exploring is, where does theology happen? Yeah. And I notice a number of churches, both in the UK and elsewhere in the world as well, that are quite becoming more serious about theology. And I notice also university faculties who are taking the church more seriously as a context for theology. So I think that's all to the good. I also see theology making connections with of human life and discipleship and prayer, and the whole realm of what one might call a kind of spiritual theology, a theology that is devoted to the nurturing of Christian life, the nurturing of good, excellent human life. I think is a really positive development. I think one of the examples of that is what you do here in Yale in the Human Flourishing Project and other things. I look at people like Ellen Chary and the work she's doing, again, in places like Princeton, thinking about how does theology contribute to the living of a good human life. And so I think those are all good things to be celebrated. There's connections between the theology of the church, theology and the living of the Christian life, and theology and prayer and worship. Those things are, and I sense those are on the rise, as opposed to, in the past, they've often been seen as quite separate from the theological task.
And then what is it that we do have to be worried about or troubled about? Or is there anything kind of not as it ought to be with theology these days? Yeah.
Now, I guess it's true generally of a lot of academic life and intellectual endeavor that as broadens out, it becomes very fragmented and it becomes quite isolated and abstruse. And sometimes you read theological work that sometimes goes on in university faculties, and it seems like a sort of small conversation happening amongst a very small group of people. Very detailed, erudite books being written for other very detailed, erudite people. And there's perhaps a necessary stage in someone's academic career where you do that. You write your doctorate, and you probably know that there aren't that going to be that many people are going to read the book. But if that's all it ever is, if it becomes a little small conversation amongst a few people who are interested in that kind of thing, then it really does raise questions about the nature and future of Christian theology. I think we do have to be concerned about the ways in which, certainly in the UK, there are quite a lot of theology faculties that are under pressure in universities. There's that sense that theology, the sort of secular universities often see theology as, well, they don't produce people who are set up to do jobs. It doesn't produce sort of quantifiable knowledge in terms of scientific discovery. It doesn't produce something that's economically valuable. Is it worth doing in itself? And especially sometimes if universities become more aggressively secular, there's a sort of desire to sort of shove theology to the margins. Theology departments have to then reinvent themselves as religious studies departments or something like that. That, again, begins to kind of erode the theological task from our life together. So I think that's a concern. There is a sense that the world outside the church doesn't necessarily listen to theologians that much. There's an element of truth for that. I suppose there's always been a bit of truth to that anyway. And that may be partly theologians' fault as much as the world's fault, rather than always blaming someone else, the fact they don't listen to us. But I think those are the kind of things that we just have to be quite concerned about, which is why I think these movements of connecting the theology with the church, with Christian life and with prayer are so significant.
You talk in your paper today about 3 different audiences that theology has in 3 different contexts. If you lay those out for us, I found that really, really helpful.
It seems to me when we do theological work, it's not like we're doing it for one particular purpose. There are a range of different purposes or audiences or directions or trajectories that we do theology in. It seems to me the first audience for theology actually is God. It seems we do our theology in this sense, not for anything. There's no particular purpose for it. We do it simply as a response of rational beings to a God who has revealed himself to us in Christ. And to that extent, and there's a long tradition of Christian theology, both in the East and the West, of theology done as worship, as prayer, as a simple response to God. Some of the great works of Christian theology of the past precisely are that. They're in the form of prayer. You think of Augustine's Confessions, you think of Anselm's Proslogion and things like that. I mean, they're basically the mind addressing God, trying to explore and declare the praises of God, if you like, in theological language. So that's the first audience of God theology. Second audience, I think, and if the first is theology in the mode of worship, this, I think, is theology in the mode of reform, in the sense that the church is this semper reformanda. It's that the church is always being reformed. The church always needs to be addressed with the word of God again. And in this mode of theology, it seems to me that what we do is we direct our theological work to and for the sake of the church, to remind the church of its identity, to explore the kind of internal coherence and structure of theology, to enable the church to be the church, to enable the church to be the people of God called out in order to be a blessing to the rest of humanity and the rest of the world. So there is a kind of ecclesial audience for theology. And I think the third audience, I think, is the world. That there is a sense in which theology is always has to be in conversation with other disciplines, reacting and responding to what is going on within the world around us. And so there's always a kind of, this is theology as witness. This is theology as declaring what life looks like, seen through the lens of the gospel, as it were. And I think it just is helpful to clarify those 3 audiences, those 3 modes of theology, because they are subtly different. There's overlap between them all. You can find yourself doing the same thing. You can look at the doctrine of the Trinity in all 3 modes, but the way you do it is always slightly different.
So given our context, so sticking on that kind of third audience of the world right now, given the increasing kind of pluralistic context in which we find ourselves, what does theology have to offer? Because it addresses this audience. What does it offer that audience? Why should that audience be interested in what theology has to say?
Yeah. I think there's a number of reasons why it's important and why it's actually crucial, I think, for the pluralistic world we're in at the moment. Partly because it seems to me the great visions that are driving human culture and society at the moment are actually they're no longer political. They're primarily religious now, for better or worse. And we know religion can be a tragedy as well as a great promise for the world as well. But the secularization thesis seemed to suggest that religion would just gradually disappear as societies and the whole world became more advanced and secular. But actually that hasn't happened at all. Religious visions are extremely powerful right the way across the world. And you can see examples of that in all different faiths, in all different cultures, all different continents. And understanding the dynamics of that is absolutely vital for our world today. And I think I'd go as far as to say, if you don't really understand religion, if you don't understand faith, if you don't understand theology, you can't really understand the modern world, because it is such a major part of motivation for so many people across the world.
Does that mean, though, that the mode of theology that the world actually needs is precisely religious studies?
Not necessarily, no, because it seems to me you can't really separate out the two, because you can treat religion as a sort of separate object for study. You can think of it, religious practices and religious history and religious, community life and so on. You can study it objectively, but it seems to me that one has to actually inhabit it to be able to really understand it. Which is why, in one sense, I always question the actual description of something called religion. It's a sort of secularist way of putting it in a little box and studying it and examining it. But actually, it's like sort of taking someone's brain out and looking at it separately. You can't do that apart from the person themselves, because religion, it actually is all about faith. It's about lived experience. It's about encounter with God. So there is an element of that. Religious studies has its place. I think the other thing I'd want to go on. So it seems to me we need to do that, because in order to understand religion in its fullness, one has to inhabit it and see its internal dynamics. But I think the other thing about theology is that I've always thought with theology, people come and ask me, should I study theology? The great thing about theological study, it actually touches on just about every human endeavor. Because if you do a degree in theology, you will do languages, you'll do history, you'll do anthropology, you'll do cultural studies, you'll do philosophy, you will do just about every other area of endeavor is caught up in this great venture of theology. Because ultimately, if theology is about these two words, theos, logos, it's words about God, being able to speak truly and rightly about God, who is the source of our being and the one to whom we return. It means an inquiry into the biggest questions of them all. And theology, properly speaking, allows you to ask those questions in a way that very few other disciplines do. So on the one hand, I think in order to understand the modern world, you've got to understand theology. But on the other hand, it seems to me theology opens up a whole series of the biggest questions, and it gives you all kinds of ways of approaching those. So it just seems to me endlessly fascinating, and I don't know why anyone else would want to do anything else.
So is there something then methodological even that theology has to offer to maybe even to people who don't share those sorts of commitments, a kind of a way of thinking holistically about the world and those big questions?
Well, I think that is right. I think regardless of whether you come to theology with a faith or without it, theology does give you this very comprehensive way of exploring big questions in a way that not many other disciplines do. If you do a history degree, you're looking at things primarily historically, and obviously there are other aspects to it too, but you don't get some of the philosophical, the linguistic, the cultural, anthropological questions that come into the study of theology. So there is a methodological aspect of it. I still think there's a big difference between doing theology with a faith and without a faith. That's one of the slight anomalous things about university theology often, that you don't have to have a faith to study theology, but I think it's a very different thing doing it when you do have a faith. And I'm not saying that doing theology without a faith is not worth something, but I just think it's a very different experience.
Yeah, certainly. So you've talked about 3 different audiences for theology and kind of 3 different, am I hearing you right? Are there 3 different purposes for theology given each of those 3 different audiences, or is there some commonality among the 3 of them, something that ties those 3 purposes together? Yeah. How do we think about that?
Yeah, they're not 3 discrete tasks, it seems to me. They're not 3 different things. It seems to be worship, kind of reform, and witness are integrally related in a sense that and I think the starting point is crucial. If the primary audience of theological work is God, that actually it's primarily worship. It's primarily simply our response of wonder and inquiry and desire to articulate God as he reveals himself to us It seems to me, if that's the primary mode of theology, that then can work itself out both as reform in the light of this God whom we are discovering, who God has, who has revealed himself to us. What does that mean, therefore, for the church and how the church lives, so that the church is more true to the God who has revealed himself to us? What does that then mean that's when it becomes witness. And so it seems to me that the primary mode of theology is this theology as worship, but that then plays itself out towards the church and the world in two separate ways. So I think there is a unity to it, but I think we need to keep in focus the audience of the church and the world, because if theology is just worship without any attention at all to what that means for the church or for the world, then it's missing something quite significant. If theology loses that dimension of worship, again, it loses its absolute heart, it seems to me, and it becomes quite functional, and it becomes quite descriptive, and it doesn't involve the heart and the soul as much as the mind. So, yeah.
So you've been engaged with theology in several different contexts. You've taught at Oxford. You've now create a different sort of theological institution in St. Mellitus. What have you learned about theology in the process of starting St. Mellitus? Which you should say, well, maybe you could first say a little bit about exactly what you're doing at St. Mellitus and what you've learned there.
Yeah, well, as you say, I was in Oxford for 16 years teaching theology there. I moved to London about 11 years ago now to help set up a kind of new experiment in theological education. And the new experiment was to tie it much more closely to the church. So this wasn't founded in the university faculty or even within a kind of diocese. It was actually closely connected to a particular local church, Holy Trinity Brompton, but also the two dioceses of London and Chelmsford that we work very closely with. So it was very much emerged out of in partnership with the church, and also doing theology in a way that was much more tied into the practice of ministry and Christian life. So rather than taking people away to a seminary for 3 years to do broadly, mainly academic studies, because this was primarily about doing theology for Christian ministry, we basically left our students in churches, and we enable them to do theology while they're engaged in actual Christian ministry. And I think what I've learned from that is two things. One is, I think theology comes alive in new ways when you do it in the church. Actually, I think originally that's where it started. It's where it belongs, and it's good that it's done in other contexts like universities and seminaries, which are sort of halfway between the university and the church. But actually we need to do more theology in local church contexts, and that can be a struggle because churches are often not used to that. But when you do theology in the context of the church, actually you find people coming alive in their faith in all kinds of ways. We've seen people discovering whole new dimensions of their Christian life by engaging with their minds, with theological work. So I think there's a sense that theology really belongs in the church, and we ought to do more of it in church contexts. I think the other thing I've learned is that, again, theology comes alive in the practice of Christian life, that there's an intimate connection between the two. When we train our ordinands in theology, we almost deliberately, you've got to throw them in the deep end, and then you have to learn how to swim. And learning how to swim is not just pragmatically, it's theologically as well. And there's something about bringing the experiences of ministry, the experiences of success, of failure, of pastoral, tragic, great joy in ministry, bringing those to the theological task, engaging those with what students are learning about the theological tradition, and getting that conversation going between Christian life and ministry and theology. That's when some really sparky things happen. And it's a different kind of enterprise. I find different questions come my way in St. Mellitus than I used to in Oxford. And in Oxford, I would get students asking me, what was the influence of late medieval nominalism on Luther's doctrine of justification? Good question. I don't get that question quite so often when I'm in St. Mellitus, because the questions are different. They're actually, what does Luther's doctrine of justification say to this person who asked me this question in the Alpha course last week about their own sense of anxiety about not having achieved very much in their life? What does that say to that? And that's the kind of question you get, which is a real life question. And so theology becomes different. It's not that it's less academic. It's not that it's less serious. Yeah. But it comes to life in new ways.
Yeah, that's what's really interesting to me, in particular, about what you're doing, is that it's not just a church training program. Yeah. This is not just training in church ministry. You're offering a theological education in the depth of that. Has that been, I suppose, how have you in institution building made sure that it, because it seems like there are these kind of two poles. The one just pull into, it's just an academic program. The other would be just a training program. But you're trying to do something in between. How do you hold that tension?
I think that's right. I mean, I've seen a lot of churches start to do their own training program. Churches have become a little bit frustrated with university faculties or seminaries and thought, well, it's all too academic. We need to train our own people. But by and large, they tend to be quite, leadership training colleges with lots of stuff on management and leadership, and they bring in gurus from different companies and so on. And that's good. That's a valuable thing. But there's not often a great deal of theological reflection in that. And I guess what we've tried to do is to do some of that, but actually to keep it profoundly theological. And I guess right from the very beginning, we felt that was important, that for us, doing theology in the context of the church wasn't going to mean a kind of dumbing down of theology or a lack of academic seriousness or a lack of real profound engagement with the theological tradition. So it's partly by holding that as a value, making sure when we hire people, we don't just hire, leadership experts, but we hire theologians. But theologians who have a passion for the church and who want to see the church thrive and grow and who see the connections between theology and Christian life. So particular kind of theologians we tend to employ. And I mean, it's not always easy because sometimes churches don't always necessarily see the need for serious theology. Sometimes the churches themselves can be quite pragmatic and how do we train our leaders and all that kind of thing. And you want to take that but keep on saying to them, actually, they really need theology. Because actually, if you're going to sustain a life of ministry, you need to know God. If you don't have your vision of God clear, if you're not doing the kind of theology that is theology as prayer, then actually you're going to burn out pretty quickly.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured theologian and Bishop Graham Tomlin and biblical scholar Matt Croasmun. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu. New episodes drop every Saturday, sometimes midweek. If you're new to the show, welcome, friend. Hit subscribe in your favorite podcast listening app, and we'd love your feedback. Ratings and reviews in Apple Podcasts are particularly helpful, but we're just as happy to hear from you by email at faith@yale.edu. We read each comment and do our best to respond and improve the show, bringing you the people and topics that you want to hear. And if you're a regular listener, it's a huge honor that you stick with us from week to week. So I'll ask you to step up and join us. Help us share the show. Behind those 3 dots in your podcast app, there's an option to share this episode by text or email or social media. If you took a brief moment to send your favorite episode to a friend or share with the world, not only would you be supporting the show, you'd be sparking up a great conversation around stuff that matters with people that matter. Thanks for listening today, friends. We'll be back with more this coming week.